All right.
Internet. We are on the internet.
We are on the internet, and we got somebody.
Hey, we got some people.
Welcome to the party,
Yay.
y'all.
Hello. Welcome to the party. Touch Mix party in the house.
That's right. Yeah, we got touch mix compression.
Compression.
Cool.
This will be round 3 of the compression topic.
Awesome. Looks like people are
Hey, there we go.
trickling
Yep,
in pretty
we're trickling in.
quickly. We're gonna wait a little bit before we do officially get started, just so some more people can come in. So while we wait, you're just gonna have to suffer through us making random jokes that come to our head.
Random banter that is in no way pre-rehearsed.
We apologize for my still picture.
And the ghost voice.
The ghost,
golden.
Yes.
It's golden. Her camera's not working today.
My
so
camera malfunctioned.
she'll just be an ominous voice, a disembodied voice talking to
I was
us.
gonna say, it's not so ominous.
Yeah, that's true. It's maybe the wrong word. Cool.
Oh, we just have that one link for them, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Great.
We have
I'll
a
that ready then.
link.
You know what? And I will go ahead and put the customer support info in there as well.
Nice. Cool. Great. If you're gonna do that, then I think we can get started. We're 2
Let's
minutes
go ahead.
in.
Yeah,
So
we can do introductions and just
yeah.
going here.
My name is Jacob. I'm going to be the moderator. So you're not going to hear a ton from me, but I'm the training coordinator at QSC. So you probably have or will chat with me at some point. But I'm just going to be moderating right now. So I'm just going to be kind of introducing everything and letting you know what's up for our webinar. We are talking about the mysteries of compression for touch mix. Well, we're not talking about it. Jason's going to be talking about it.
Heyo.
He'll be leading you through. We also have Golden, the mysterious voice.
Hey.
Yep. She's going to help answer all the questions you might have. And speaking of questions, we want you to feel involved. We want you to ask any questions that you might have. Let me get that. Here we go. So if you do have questions, go ahead and throw them in the Q&A, and we'll get to them, or Golden will get to them as she can. But we just want to make sure that you stay on topic with the questions that you have. If we start asking questions that are off topic, the webinar will have to get off track, and then it'll become very long, and we just don't have that time today, nor do you. Maybe you do. I don't know your life. But anyways.
We don't.
Yeah. We want you to stay on topic, but if you do have questions that you feel you really need answered that don't relate to the topic, we have information up right now for our support team, and they're a fantastic team that will definitely be able to answer any questions you have. So I think Golden has thrown that into the chat, that information, if you want to copy it down and have that in case you ever need it. They're a great team who will be able to help you out. If you do have questions, though, that are related to the topic, like I said, throw them in the Q&A. You can also raise your hand. There's an option to click a button, raise your hand. A little hand will pop up next to your name. And that just tells us that you have a microphone and that you might want to chat with Jason and Golden about the question that you have. The only thing we ask is that if you do want to do that, you still throw your question in the Q&A. That way we can just make sure it's related to the topic at hand. You're not trying to sneak one in on us.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah. Other than that, though, I think that's all I got. You good, Jason?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Cool.
Let's go ahead and get going. The other thing, it sounds like Golden threw the tech support information and the customer service information in the chat. There also should be a link to an audio streaming service. So
I just threw that in there, yeah.
Perfect. Okay. So everyone that's on the webinar right now, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and click that link. And what that is that is going to be how I will be streaming the audio from my mixer here. So my mixer that I'm going to be playing with throughout this, I'm going to be running audio. I've got tracks loaded up. I'm going to be running audio through that. And we're going to be doing some critical listening, kind of playing with the compressor as we go. So in order to maintain the kind of the fidelity of that audio, we're streaming it through a browser, another service that allows us to stream through a browser. It keeps and maintains its high fidelity, and also allows you, as the participants, the ability to kind of mix that audio versus my voice within the Zoom call here separately. So if you need something to be louder or softer at all, you have the ability to do that on your own. So there you go. Hopefully everyone has grabbed that. I'm going to go ahead and give us a little test. I'm going to go ahead and play a few seconds of today's track. It's a lovely track. Go ahead and hit play on this. All right, so we're streaming the track now. Hopefully everyone's got that happening in their browser. As soon as you click on that link, it should open up a browser and it should automatically start to transmit to you. And you'll see you have some meters at the top of the browser that you'll see the audio coming in on. Next to the meters is a little loudspeaker icon. If you click that, you'll get a little slider that you can adjust the volume within that browser window. Cool. So here is our track. I'm going to stop that. Cool. All right. And with that, let's go ahead and just get ourselves into this. Pull something up here. Okay. So as Jacob mentioned at the top here, we are talking about compression today. Compression is one of the most common tools used in audio mixing and engineering, both in live sound and recording applications. So what is a compressor? What does it do, and how and when should you use it, or why do we use these? Over the course of this lesson today, I will attempt to answer these questions and shed some light on the mystery that is compression. We'll also be taking a look at a few different compressors and outline the differences and similarities both in the approach to the controls as well as the interface. And as I already mentioned, along the way we're going to be taking a listen to the compressor that is on the TouchMix. So I just kind of would like to state this lesson is for the most part sort of mixer agnostic. This is not necessarily a TouchMix lesson. I'm kind of just approaching the topic of compression, which is just a general audio engineering topic. And we're going to be talking about it, and I'm going to be using the compressor on the TouchMix for a lot of the demonstration today. With that said, I will kind of be highlighting a few things on the TouchMix specifically that are pretty cool related to this, but we'll get to those as we go. But other than that, yeah, I just kind of wanted to kind of break down compression and hopefully help you guys out with understanding what it's doing and when and why you apply it. Now, I'm not claiming to make everybody experts on the topic of compression, within the next hour or so. It would take many more webinars to kind of fully educate you on it. But I'm just going to try to at least define, what the tool is, how it works, and hopefully give you guys a good idea of what the different controls and what the different parameters do to the audio signal that you're applying the compression to, and give you guys a few guidelines on maybe how to start using it and how to kind of find the proper settings for the sound that you're trying to compress within your mix. All right, so let's go ahead and just answer the first question. What is a compressor? Well, a compressor is a tool in audio engineering that is used to condense or compress the dynamic range of an audio signal. So the dynamic range is referencing the volume level of a signal over time. So if you think of an audio signal, at certain times the signal might be very loud, and at other times it might be very soft. And just about any musical performance has a natural range in volume, whether we're talking about a single instrument or a single voice or an entire ensemble or an entire mix. Things are going to be increasing and lowering in volume over time as you play them. So a compressor is used to bring the level of the lowest point in that audio signal and the loudest point in the audio signal closer together so that you can better control the overall dynamic range of that signal, and that can allow you to get a better handle on it within a mix and allow it to sit in a mix a lot easier and allow your job as a mix engineer to be much more simple. It can also have a lot of creative benefits as well, which we won't touch on quite as much in this lesson, but it certainly does have a wide range of creative uses as well as its functional use of just kind of condensing and stabilizing and being able to maintain the dynamic range of a signal. Okay, so to help illustrate this, I have a few illustrations I'd like to show you. And I'll switch over to that. Okay, so this is my drawing of an audio waveform. So an audio signal or audio sound is essentially just fluctuations in air pressure, right? And so those fluctuations come with a high point and a low point, or a peak and a valley. So this is a very simplified graphic representation of what an audio signal looks like, both digitally and physically moving through the air, moving through physical space. In terms of in the digital realm, we are going to be applying a compressor to this signal. And what that means is at some point, we're going to apply what's called a threshold. And we're going to get more into that as we go. So a threshold is kind of set or determined at some point in that audio signal closer to where the loudest points are, or the high peaks of the signal are. As you can see where I've got it here on the graphic. And so we set that threshold, and when we apply the compressor, you end up with something like that. So the compressor takes over at the point in which those peaks are breaching your threshold, and the compressor compresses them. So it's only compressing the peaks, as you can see here. So we're only compressing sort of the loudest parts. We're not compressing the entire signal, which is important to kind of understand. So the compressor is only working within the range above whatever its threshold is set to, okay? And then from that point, it's simply going to manage and soften those loud points and try to bring them a little closer to where the low ports are, so we have a smaller dynamic range, as you can see illustrated here. But you can see there that you're still getting a little bit of the signal above the threshold. We're not completely stopping it at the threshold. That would, for one thing, probably cause clipping. It also would institute what's known as a limiter, which is like a compressor but different, and that's another webinar topic altogether. So it's good to understand that we are setting a threshold. However, we're not necessarily stopping the audio at that threshold. We're just lessening the audio after the threshold. To extrapolate this idea, this is slightly more realistic graphic representation of an audio signal over time. As you can see, it kind of fluctuates a little bit. And the beginning part of it, it's got smaller peaks, and in the middle section, it's got really, really loud peaks, and then it gets quiet again. So with this in mind, we would apply a compressor to somewhere about there. So we would set it somewhere, so we're kind of just compressing the very, very loud parts when they happen in the signal. So we're not necessarily compressing the signal all the time, because we might not need to. When it's within a certain or under a certain range, it's fine. We don't need to worry about it. But then, it's only at the times when it's getting exceedingly loud, at that point, we want to compress it a little bit, and we'll end up with something like that. So the peaks above the threshold are compressed, and then as you can see, what that signal looks like with the compressor engaged, with those peaks significantly softened above that threshold, the entire dynamic range is more in line with itself. It's more manageable this way. You have a more consistent dynamic range. So as you can see from the graphic here, the compression is reducing the range of the signal by bringing down the level of the loudest parts. That's actually what it's doing. That means that the loud parts and the quiet parts are now closer together. And the natural volume variations are going to be less obvious. But now, by attenuating the signal, so what we're actually doing with the compressor is kind of attenuating those really loud parts. So we're kind of quieting it down. At that point, once you have that smaller, or that condensed dynamic range, you can actually take the entire signal and you can boost it a little bit, and that'll give you the effect of the quieter parts of the signal actually sounding louder, but then when the loud parts happen, they're not overwhelming, and they're still very well maintained and managed. So cool. So that is basically what a compressor does, very crudely drawn out in my graphics here. So I'll switch back here. Simple enough, right? Well, maybe not. So understanding what a compressor is supposed to do doesn't necessarily outline how to get the compressor to do that. So applying compression is not necessarily black and white. Depending on what signal you are compressing, you need to set it up a little bit differently to get the best results. Applying compression to a vocal channel, for example, will require slightly different settings than if we're trying to compress a snare drum signal, and even more different for an electric guitar or bass guitar or even piano, horns, things like that. So different signal types will require slightly different compressor settings to get the compressor to work naturally on that signal and kind of give you the best and optimized settings for that signal. Furthermore, a good compressor will allow the user to achieve this much more effectively than a lesser quality compressor. So not all compressors are created equal. That is something that I do want to kind of state out there. So depending on what the equipment you're working with, you could get varied results. A nice high-end, high-quality compressor is going to give you a nice, pleasing sound. Once you get that compressor working, once you get it kind of within the parameters that are going to work for whatever signal you're using, versus a not so good compressor or lesser made compressor, or things like that. The main difference there usually is the level of perceived distortion in your output signal from the compressor, but there are a few other qualities, different tonal differences and coloration that they can add, which does kind of get into the realm of being subjective, but in general, having a nice quality compressor is going to make your job a lot easier when you use it versus potentially making things muddier or sounding worse. All right, so that's my upfront spiel. Hopefully that more or less answered the overall question. What is compression? What is a compressor? What is it doing? Okay, we get that. Let's go ahead and dive in to the mixer now and talk about some of the controls. So first thing we're going to want to do is get into our compressor, and just a little, what word am I thinking of? To tell you about what I've got going on here, what we're going to be listening to and working with. So this is a mix that is about 95% done. So as you can see, as I go through my mix here on the touch mix screen, it is a full 24 channel mix, and I've got my fader levels all set. So I've got a nice balanced fader mix. All of my channels do have EQ processing on them. So if I kind of scrub through all of my various channels, we do have EQ throughout every channel on the mix. A few of the channels actually already have some compressor settings engaged on them, but not all of them. So what we're going to be doing is kind of filling out or completing, applying the compression to a few of our channels in here. And the other thing that this mix is missing are effects. So I don't have any effects engaged on any of these channels at all. And I kind of built it up to this point for this lesson because this is more or less at what point you would be applying compression within an actual workflow. So first you kind of go in, you set your fader levels, you go in and you kind of get your EQ going, and you EQ all of your channels and you get a nice EQ mix that way, and then you go in and you start applying your compressors to your various channels. And then your final stage would be sweetening your mix with your effects. So kind of that's where we are right now. I already played you kind of the track up front, so we don't need to do that again. We'll listen to it as we go. A couple other things I want to do here. I'm going to be primarily working with my lead vocal channel, which is this male vocal channel right here. You can see that one. So that is what we're going to be focusing on primarily. Once we get that dialed in, we'll talk a little bit about the two backing vocal channels. We'll apply some compression to that, and then depending on how much time I've chewed up at that point, we might go over to the bass. I've got two bass channels here. Then I'll go ahead and, which I don't have the compressor engaged there yet. If I have time, I'll throw a compressor setting on that, and we'll kind of A and B with and without a compressor, just to kind of illustrate using a compressor on a vocal channel versus an instrument channel. And the main difference, the primary difference, is, well, more so in live sound, I will say. If you're building a mix for a live sound application, your compressor on a vocal channel is going to be much more functional, meaning you don't really want to actually hear much of the compressor itself. You just kind of want it to mitigate your dynamic range so that you can get that vocal channel to sit nicely in the mix and kind of be heard at all times, no matter what level the singer is at, but also not overpower anything if the guy or girl is just kind of like really wailing and belting into the microphone. So the compressor is a lot more functional. It can be used creatively, certainly, but we're going to be kind of like just taking a look at the more functional aspect of it. And then when we get into using it on instruments like bass guitar or electric guitars or even like snare drum, things like that, at that point, even in a live setting, the compressor, the line towards functional and creativity is a lot finer. So you can definitely use it as a more creative tool and give some cool coloration and things like that to instruments. So let's go ahead and get into it. So we'll go ahead and start off by entering in my vocal channel. One other thing I'm going to do that I haven't done because I wanted to show you this process is throughout the this mix, I want to give myself the ability to solo channels. I want to be able to isolate single channels throughout the channel. So I'm going to use a feature that is exclusive to the TouchMix 30 here called Solo in Place. And what it does is it changes the function of our cue system here. So normally if I would engage a cue on a channel, it's just going to not redirect, it's going to split that audio and send it to the cue output on the mixer itself, and allows you to listen to that channel on a pair of headphones or desktop monitor, something like that. If I go into menu, mixer setup, and I engage solo in place, that first option there, now it changes the function of my cue button to solo in place. You can see they turned kind of an amber orange there, and now they have an SIP indication in them instead of cue. SIP stands for solo in place. Now what that's going to do is it's actually, when I engage that, it's going to solo that channel out in the main mix. So it's a really easy way of just soloing out different channels as I go, and then we can all listen to them in isolation, which will be helpful for kind of getting our ears acclimated to what the compressor is doing by kind of isolating the channel that we're compressing. All right, let's go ahead and get into this. I'm going to go into my vocal channel here, and I'm going to go ahead and go into my compressor, engage my compressor tab at the top. And the first thing I'm going to want to do is turn it on. So I've got my compressor out and in switch there, so I can engage that. Now my compressor is on. And we'll kind of take a look at it right now just in its default settings, and then we'll kind of tweak it as we go, and then we'll actually get into some of the presets. So first things first, from top to bottom here, the first things that I want to talk to you about are the meters. There are 3 meters at the top of the compressor, and various compressors might show these meters in different locations or in different representations, but every compressor should have an input and an output meter, which is right here indicated by the in and the out. So this is showing you your signal coming in to your compressor, and then the out is showing you your signal going out of the compressor. When you start to use the compressor, you might notice that the output is different than the input because we're attenuating the signal within the compressor. In the middle, we have the GR meter, which stands for gain reduction. So this is actually showing us, at what point the compressor is, well, my computer wants to restart. That's great. No, thank you. Automatic updates. Yeah, I'm going to go with not now. That would have been fun. So the gain reduction is showing us, you'll be able to use that to find the point at which point your compressor is starting to compress the signal, and then once it's compressing, it'll show you how much attenuation it's applying. Let's check it out. I'm going to start the track up here, start it over again, and I will, actually for now I don't need to solo that out. Once we start dialing it in, we will. All right, so right off the bat, I've got input and output. So you can see they're the same thing, because at this point the compressor isn't doing anything. So let's start kind of getting some things going here and see if we can get it to engage. The next control, or the first control that you're going to want to adjust or take a look at or understand even, is going to be the threshold, which I already mentioned in my awesome slideshow about compressors. That's this guy right here. So here's your threshold. What the threshold does is it sets the level at which the compressor engages. So simple as that. It's going to essentially determine, so to put it another way, a compressor, to restate what it is going to compress the loudest parts of the signal, right? Well, the threshold is where you can determine at what point is loud. Where is the point of loudness? Where do we want to start compressing from? And to find this point, it might be really helpful to pay attention to this gain reduction meter here. So if I engage this signal, I can use my wheel here, which you can't really see, but it's there. You can either use the slider there like that, or I can use my wheel like this. And this is going to help you find the point at which it's going to engage initially. So if I play this track over again, let's solo the vocals out at this point. Wait for this to come in. There he is. We'll turn him up a little bit. All right, so he's singing. Let's engage our threshold. We'll pull this down. Okay, there we go. So we've got pretty significant amount of gain reduction happening at this point. And it looks like it's catching him just about every time he comes in. So it's applying a pretty heavy amount of compression. So depending on how how you set this, again, will kind of be the first step in the behavior of the compressor. So we back it off to something like this. All right, so it's still pretty heavily compressing. All right. So that looks pretty good. Now just to really kind of drive the point of this home, I'm going to really, really lay into this. So if I were just to take this way, way, way down. Hear what that's doing? So the most noticeable thing that's happening is that it's getting a lot quieter, right? Because it's attenuating this signal constantly. So we have, our gain reduction meter is never letting off when we have this thing that far digging into it. And so that's not necessarily what we want, okay? So that's one of the things that can happen if your threshold is set a little too far, or in this case, at an extremely, extremely low level. Because again, we don't want to just compress and at this point repress the entire signal. We still want it to be dynamic and be musical, but we want to manage the dynamic range, right? So somewhere around, I've got it right here at -20, looks pretty good. It's cutting in. You can see it cutting in pretty well there, but it goes away and it's not overly attenuating him. If I take it out, you should hear a noticeable difference now. So that's out. Now that's in. So again, for what I'm hearing is it does get a little bit quieter. So again, and a compressor is going to attenuate your signal, and we'll get to compensating for that in a minute. But if it's going in and out of here, I'm actually going to restart my track. Out. Now that's in. So I pull the mix back in. Okay. So right now, it is overall a little quieter, but it's more consistent. It has a little bit more consistency within the mix, which again can help you. So maybe we can use that. Okay, maybe yeah, it's a little quieter, but I can just give it a little more in the channel fader, and that can compensate for it. There's another way to do it, which we'll get to in a minute. But first, I want to kind of get us through the rest of our settings here. So hopefully threshold we understand, and again, kind of setting that threshold can take some trial and error. One of the things that I do want to kind of say at this point, and I'll probably repeat it a couple times, when you're learning how to mix, when you're learning how to use a tool like a compressor or an EQ, or even learning how to use effects, things like that, use your ears. It's audio, it's sound. You hear it. So your ears are your best tools. Yes, we do have meters and other things that we can use sort of as visual telemetry to kind of get an idea of what it's doing. But ultimately, you need to be able to learn. You need to learn to use your ears and trust your ears, and use your judgment that way as to what sounds good and what doesn't. But generally, obviously, setting the threshold too low, we don't want that. And if you set it too high, what you end up with is no compression at all. So if we leave it, go back to closer to where the default setting was, it's about -12. It's a little bit catching now, but for the most part, it's not doing anything. Depending on what you're doing, that might be fine, but the threshold is going to allow you, the threshold and your gain reduction meter are going to allow you to kind of find that sweet spot. All right, now let's take a look at the ratio, which is the next control over here. The ratio is the amount of compression that is applied to the signal once it gets over the threshold. And it is expressed as a ratio. And so basically, the higher the ratio, the more compression will be applied. And to explain it a little further, if I start to manipulate this, if I take this all the way down, it is expressed as this. So if I leave it at 2:1, as you can see there, that ratio is a 2:1 ratio. So that's telling me that for every 2 decibels, or every 2 dB, that my signal goes over my threshold, whatever that's set to. So every 2 decibels above that threshold, the compressor is then going to compress that 2 decibels to 1 decibel. All right? So at 2 to 1, that's what's happening. So if you go over 2 decibels, that 2 decibels becomes 1 decibel. If you go over 4 decibels, that 4 decibels becomes 2 decibels. If you go over 6 decibels, that becomes 3 decibels, and so on and so on. So you kind of get the idea of how it extrapolates out. That's how you can kind of understand your ratio. If I take this down to 1 to 1, a 1-to-1 ratio is nothing. So if you go above the threshold at 1 to 1, great, you're going above your threshold, but the compressor is still not going to work. You're not going to do anything because there's no compression ratio. So again, the higher this ratio goes, the more compression is applied. And if I go to something a little more extreme, if I go way down to like 8 to 1, that's telling me that for every 8 dB I go above my threshold, it's going to compress that 8 dB to 1 dB. That is an extreme level of compression. Again, to extrapolate that even further, that means if you go over 16 dB, that compresses it down to 2 dB. So that's a high rate of compression, probably going to be a lot more obvious when your compressor is engaging. And again, a high ratio like that is moving closer to the direction of being a limiter, which we won't get into today, but that's what you're getting close to at that point. Let's listen to this isolated. So I'm going to take this out. Okay. So if with a 1-to-1 ratio, I can punch this in and out, and nothing happens, okay? Now let's take this down. Go back to our 2 to 1. Okay, so now we get our gain reduction. We're showing, okay, we're compressing now. We're getting ourselves over this threshold, and we're applying that 2 to 1 ratio. And now, turning that on and off, we can definitely hear some of that change. Now, let's get extreme for 2 reasons. So you can really, really get an idea of that extreme compression level. And a lot of times, if you kind of really dig into these settings and take them to their extreme positions, it can help acclimate your ear to the sound of the compressor. So it's a little bit easier to hear it, even when it is in more of a normal range. So what we're hearing here, take it out, engage. So this is a similar sound to what we heard when we had our threshold really low, right? The biggest difference between this being extreme and the threshold being extreme is when you have an extreme ratio, you see it's not, whereas opposed to where our threshold being low, it was compressing the entire time, it's not. It's because we still have that threshold at a normal level, so it's just compressing it every time it goes over the threshold, which gives us sort of like this pumping effect that you can kind of hear. And it starts to get kind of darker and a little muddy sounding. And on, if you really get really extreme with it, or even on some compressors, it would start to distort at this point as well. Yeah. All right. So hopefully that helps you kind of hear what the compressor is doing at that extreme level. And now if we take it back to like 2.1, let's get a little more. Get it like 3, 2.7. Song's going to end. We'll restart. Okay. All right, now I'm going to bring it back in. So that should be slightly more obvious to what it's doing. Again, using the compressor for the vocals here, my goal here is to use it more functionally versus for coloration or for creativity. So to get it set kind of where I want it, the effect of the compressor is going to be very subtle. They're going to be kind of very subtle changes. It's just going to help me to moderate the dynamics, as I've said so many times already. Cool, so that is threshold and ratio. Hopefully we are pretty clear on what those are at this point. Now I want to kind of talk about this graph. The graph is one of the things that is unique to the compressor on the touch mix. This is really cool, and this is going to kind of lead me into the next parameters down here, which are attack and release, because these have to do with time, how the compressor reacts over time. And what you're getting with this graph is a representation of that effect over time. So what we have here, if I back this off a little bit, is just a static graphic representation of an audio signal, so you can kind of visualize, okay, this is working with an audio signal. And as you move these parameters, this line will move. So our threshold, when we increase it or decrease it, it moves the entire line up and down throughout that signal. Our ratio will affect the dip here, which is the actual compression. And then our attack and release here are going to affect how the compressor reacts over time. So our attack is going to dictate how long it takes the compressor to reach its point of full compression. So if we're at the, oh, I messed that up. Keep it at around 2.9, that's fine. We got about -20 here. Yeah, that's about where I want it. So to get to the point of the full 3-to-1 compression, it's going to take, at its default setting here, 1.8 milliseconds. And both of these are expressed in milliseconds. So realistically, this is happening extremely fast, but it does definitely have an effect on how the compressor reacts to the signal. And it is important to get these kind of in an appropriate range depending on what you're compressing. So again, our default attack is 1.8 milliseconds. The slowest possible attack time is 0.5, so that's virtually nothing. So that is essentially going to give you the effect of immediate compression. And we're going to listen to this in a second, but if I go all the way out, I can get it up to 50 milliseconds. So you can see as I move that control, our graphic adjusts itself accordingly. So you can kind of visually see, okay, now it's taking longer. Once I've reached the threshold, it's going to take it longer to reach that point of compression. The inverse here is release. The release dictates how long it takes the compressor to release itself, to get back to the point of no compression once the signal has dropped back below the threshold. And again, that is represented here by that slope kind of getting more extreme or more subtle. So the longest I can have on the release is 1,000 milliseconds, so I can have a much longer attack potential. And again, the quickest, release is 50 milliseconds. So in general, the attack is going to be longer than, or the release, is going to be longer than the attack. And now let's play with these. So I think the default was about 100 there. Get this back to around 1.8, and we'll solo this guy out again. And play. There we go. So let's go ahead and spin it. I'm going to dig into the compressor a little more just to kind of illustrate the effect of this more dramatically. Okay, so with a slow attack time, or a fast attack time, you can hear it kind of clamping, chomping down as soon as he comes in with his phrase, he's compressed. So the difference is, as you move this out, what I'm saying. All right. It sounds more musical, right? It's not, his voice has, the clarity comes back. So what we're actually doing with a quick attack time, or the faster the attack time, another way to think of it is actually controlling the attack of the signal, or the transient of the signal. So with a very fast attack time, as soon as the sound hits, as soon as that initial transient comes into the compressor, it's immediately compressing. So it's going to compress and darken the initial attack of the sound. If you back it off a little bit, what you're doing is you're kind of allowing the attack to punch through, and then once the attack kind of kind of punches through, then the compressor engages and it compresses more of the sustain of it. So you can really control how much of the attack of the sound you want by managing the attack control, or the attack time of the compressor. And to illustrate the opposite end of this, if I go all the way out, that sounds weird too, right? Turn that off. So again, we're getting with a really slow attack time on our vocal channel here. The effect is similar to what we were hearing with an overly high ratio. It's just sort of kind of like a little bit of a pumping effect, because it's just basically not the compressor, isn't engaging until the very tail end of his phrase. So a lot more of his initial signal is punching through, and then it's kind of clamping down, and then he stops singing and it releases. And so it's kind of at the point in his phrases or his cycles of singing, at the point at which the compressor is actually compressing is at an awkward point. It doesn't make a lot of sense to leave it that wide. So somewhere a little closer, somewhere actually the default setting wasn't bad at all. That sounds a lot more musical. And I can back these up to somewhere a little more normal. Go a little bit more if we want. A little quicker. Again, the changes are subtle, but hopefully you're able to kind of pick them out. Okay, now let's mess with the attack. Okay, we'll leave the release. We'll leave the attack about right there. I like that. So the release, again, is the opposite. So if I go with a really fast release, so that means the compressor is, as soon as his signal goes below our threshold, which I will take to a little bit more of an extreme, so we can really hear what this is doing. So it's still, now we're in the back of realm of this kind of weird unnatural sound. It's just kind of like as soon as he stops singing, then it throws the compressor off and releases it immediately. It's not natural sounding. It's a little artificial. On the other side of it, I'm going to restart the track. If I go way too long, we're going to get a very similar effect to the attack actually being too long. The difference is instead of not grabbing until way after he's kind of started singing, it's not releasing fast enough. So it's holding it in a compressed state even after he's kind of backed off for a certain period of time below our threshold. It's just taking the compressor a longer time to kind of reach that state of uncompressed signal, which can, depending on what the other parameters are set to, can actually make the compressor not ever let off between the different phrases. And that's usually not what you want. You want it to sort of at least be resetting itself between each phrase of whatever you're compressing, in this case the vocal. So when he stops singing in between every one of his phrases, you want the compressor to be reset to 0, and then so it's fresh, so it's recompressing and compressing every phrase kind of fresh and from a new starting point. Otherwise, it's going to be pretty unnatural. So on this guy, you can actually have a fairly quick attack time. Hopefully, hear that. So the longer I let this go, it sort of has this kind of like darkening and almost, again, a pumping effect, which can be useful in a creative way if you're going for that. But for the purposes of this, that's not what I want. So that sounds okay to me. We'll back this up to about 20. Get this back up to about 3. I liked it around 3. All right, now, we talked about the signal in general kind of being attenuated because we're compressing it. Our gain knob here is how we can compensate for that directly in the compressor. It's a pretty cool tool. Other compressors might call this makeup gain. It's the same thing. We just call it gain. It's just a gain stage in the compressor itself, so you can kind of give it back the gain that you're attenuating with your gain reduction there. And that is, again, how we can boost it So now that we've compressed the signal, so we've got a nice refined dynamic range. Now we can take that whole thing and just goose it up a little bit. It's like moving the entire thing up slightly in the mix. And that gives you the effect of kind of like the quieter parts in the signal being boosted a little bit, but your loud parts, still aren't going to get out of hand. So now we can hear that. I'll take it down. Give it. And again, our meters here can give us a really good indication of at what point we can match. So with it pulled all the way out, we can see our input is at one level, and our output is a little off. It's not quite hitting what we're hitting over here. So if we could just take the makeup gain a little bit and see if we can get it. Ideally, again, for my purposes, I'm simply just want to match as close as I can the output to the input. That looks 3 or 4 dB should do that. Inversely, not related to compression, but since this gain is here, you can use that gain actually just as another gain stage. So if you just want to apply a little bit more gain to this point, to within your channel. So if you got your trim set to a certain level, maybe you even are applying a little bit of digital gain, and you want to just add a third gain stage to your signal, you can do it in the compressor. You can kind of leave the compressor settings. You can take the threshold all the way down, so the compressor is never actually going to engage. Whoops, and just use the gain to kind of give a little more gain to the signal. It's another kind of a useful trick within the compressor. But in this case, I do want to be applying the compression because that's what we're talking about. So if I unsolo that, give ourselves that, let's go 3 dB. Now, I'm going to restart it one more time for us. I'm going to turn it off. Yeah. So in the context of the mix now, whoops, listen to that part. Take it off. Just sort of cleans it up a little bit and allows it to sit a lot better in the mix. Oops, I'm looking at the wrong thing. Punched in the wrong channel somehow. Whoopsies, there we go. All right, yeah, so it's really nice, and it's at a nice level within the mix. Okay, I'm gonna stop this. Let's go ahead and pull up a preset real quick. So that was just kind of me explaining the parameters, and through that process, we kind of dialed it in and found some acceptable settings that would work for this channel. I'm gonna go ahead and just recall a preset now. I'm gonna go into presets here. I'm gonna go into the vocals and speech. I'm going to go into the music type because this is a musical application, and he's a male vocalist, and you can see that this preset will have a compressor setting in it with the comp indication. I've already named it, and I've already got my channel level set, so I'm going to engage these first 2 recall options. There are a couple of recall options when you recall presets. Normally, if you have all of these engaged, when you recall a preset, it's going to reset the entire channel. It's going to give you an EQ setting. In this case, it's going to give us a compressor setting. It's also going to rename the channel based on the name of the preset. It's also going to take our fader level all the way down. So if we have a couple of options down here, so if we don't want all of those things to happen, so let's say we've already dialed in our fader level, which I've done. I've already named my channel. And I don't want the preset to affect those 2 things. I just want it to recall the compressor and EQ settings. So I can hit these omit options. Then I've got it selected up here, and I can hit recall, and we've recalled the preset. Now if we go back over to the compressor, we can take a look at what the generic. So we took a look at the blank more or less are the default settings when you just power the mixer on. Dialed in from there, and now we have taking a look at a preset. Let's kind of like take a look at what the preset did versus just the stock settings here. The first thing we can see is the threshold is still set pretty modestly. We've got negative 13.5 versus a negative 12 on the default setting. And as you can see already, when we dialed in ourselves, we're going to have to get that a lot higher. But if we take a look at the ratio, it's given us a 3-to-1 ratio based on us kind of telling it that it is a male vocal channel. We've got 3.2 milliseconds on the attack, so that is slightly longer than where I had it. And still, again, slightly longer on the release as well. So we got 115. I had it, I think, around 90, if I remember correctly. I'm not sure. So those are slightly longer a little bit. So really what the preset did, it's actually pretty close to what I did. The biggest difference being the threshold there. But most of these settings are set slightly conservatively in the preset, and you can kind of dial them in from there. Obviously, the first thing that, no matter what, whether you're kind of dialing in your own compressor settings or whether you recall a preset and then you need to adjust the preset settings from there, the first thing you're probably going to want to adjust is the threshold and make sure that the compressor is engaging at all first and engaging at the right time and not being overly compressed with a threshold that's too low. We try to avoid it being too low by setting them relatively conservatively. So you might find that the threshold might need to be brought down a little bit based on our signal. In this case, we know that it does already. We can take that down to about 20, which is where I had it. The rest of the settings are probably pretty good. It's giving us 2 dB, and the gain I had mine at 3, so pretty close. And I wanted to recall that just to illustrate that the presets get you pretty close. The presets are actually completely usable and very effective in terms of an overall mix. They can get you, we say no less than 80% of the way to a full and complete channel strip setting. And that might mean that you just kind of fine tune it and tweak it from there. It's a great head start. If you're more of a novice, you can use it as sort of a learning tool, or you can kind of just recall the presets and go. And it's, it might not be totally dialed in for what it can be, but it's going to work and it's going to sound good. So you're not going to be at a loss. This also reminded me of one other parameter that I forgot to mention, which is the knee. So you can see in the dip of the compressor here, the knee, what was called the knee, is the transition in between the non-compressed to the compressed signal. Previously, when we were looking at this, that was a lot more rounded, if you'll remember. Now it's very sharp. It's a sharp point, and that is because the knee has been turned off. So if I hit that control right there, you can see now we've got that nice rounded scoop back, and if I take that out, now it's called a hard knee versus what's known as a soft knee. And what that is, it's literally the transition of the signal going from uncompressed to compressed. And when you engage the knee, or you get that soft knee, that's just smoothing out that transition a little bit, and it's making the effect of the compressor less obvious at the point of compression. And when you disengage it like that, that's kind of, it's a little bit more obvious at when the compressor kicks in. It could also kind of give it a cool effect. So let's listen to what this sounds like with our threshold brought down. Everything else I've left alone. Let's just kind of see what we get. Okay, reaction there. Take it down a little bit more. All right, this transition is special. All right, I'm gonna go back to that for a second. All right, so right when the song hits the verse, the band kind of tightens up and backs off, but the lead singer guy, he just kind of like belts a nice sustained note right over the top of him and then drops down into his verse. So for the first bar of that transition, the band kind of tightens up and drops down, and he goes for it, and he's soaring over the top of them. That's a really cool moment in the track to kind of analyze what the compressor is doing and A and B what's happening. So let's listen to that part with the compressor disengaged. I'm going to play it from there. Okay. So initially, when he first hits that note, when he's kind of sorting it kind of almost sounds disconnected for a moment. He's kind of just on top of the band versus with the band. And then he drops down into his verse, and it sounds a little bit better, but it's still sort of the dynamics are still kind of a little wonky in there with him versus the band. So let's take it back and listen to that same thing, focusing on the compressor being on. Go. Go. Yeah. That. So the whole passage now from that transition, he's thrown over them. He doesn't ever get out of hand. It sounds glued together. It sounds like a nice, tight, cohesive performance of everyone fitting together and mixing well. All right. Cool. Now, real quick, that's pretty good on our male vocal channel. I want to go ahead and discuss the backup vocals really quickly, and for this I'm just going to recall a custom preset that was created beforehand to illustrate this point. I'm going to go to my custom presets. We'll go ahead and grab our female backup settings. We'll go to both of them. We got 2 here, so we're just going to apply the same setting to both of them. And this is what I want to point at. So immediately, it should be pretty obvious. Whoop, there we go. So there's our female backup compressor there. So we're compressing the backing vocals more aggressively than the lead singer. And that is a pretty common technique for live sound, especially if you're dealing with backup singers. The reason for that is because typically what you want is for the background singers to kind of sit in the mix just behind the lead singer, right? You don't necessarily want them at the level of the lead singer. You kind of set them back underneath the lead singer a little bit because they're just providing backup. They're just comping the singer. So because they're at a slightly lower level, we don't want them to ever be buried or drown out. So we compress them a little more aggressively, and that squishes their dynamic range a little more, and that way we can still hear them at all times, even though they're at a slightly lower level in the mix overall. And so what we get is something like this. Let's see if we can. Yeah, there they are. See, I bet you didn't even hear them before. Hear them back there? See, they're pretty low in the mix, you can hear. But they're not gone. They're not going to sing, of course. Wait for it. Wait for it. I have to restart the track. There they are. Okay. So they're just an extra little presence in the mix. Before I engage the compressors, I bet you didn't hear them at all. They just get washed out. They get buried in the mix. But you sit them back behind a little bit, give them a hearty level of compression, and then they kind of pop out. It's just kind of some extra little sparkle to your ears. It's kind of a cool effect in the mix. Now, what time is it? 4:59. Okay, let's do this. I'm gonna pop over real quick to my bass. You know what? I might not get into that. There's one other thing I wanted to get into here. And that is, so let me give you a sort of a disclaimer, something that is we feel is worth mentioning here. There is a potential when you start using compression. One of the adverse effects that you might experience is something called compressor latch. When you're losing a compressor, and it really only happens, obviously, I'll explain why. It happens in live performances only, and it basically, what the effect of it is, you got the mix dialed in, everything sounds really cool when the band is playing, and then the song ends, the band stops playing, and you immediately get feedback. The PA starts to feedback, it takes off immediately. This is happening because, or potentially because of something called compressor latch. Basically what it is it means that the threshold is likely set far too low on a vocal channel or something like that, usually a vocal channel. And so like what I showed you earlier, when I had this way low and we were seeing that it was compressing all the time. So if you get a setting like this where the compressor is just compressing your signal constantly, very heavily when that performer is performing, and then from that point you kind of get them staged in the mix with your fader level and everything, and everything sounds balanced. The problem is when the singer stops singing, now the compressor lets go, and because when it's being compressed, it is being heavily attenuated. When that singer stops singing, that attenuation goes away and the mic level goes way up immediately, and the system becomes unstable immediately and you get feedback. So that is something that you really want to watch out for, is that compressor latch. It's very easy to overcome it. If you notice that's happening, go into your compressor on your microphones and start to kind of back off the threshold a little bit, because again, you don't want them to be slamming things at all times, for the most part, especially a microphone. Now you could apply that level of compression to maybe a bass guitar that has a direct input. That would be fine because it's not a microphone. It's not ever going to take off on you. But still, be wary of setting your thresholds too far down, because again, it can make things muddy and unpleasant to listen to, and you might end up with this feedback issue. So there you go. And with that, if you guys are still sticking around, I'll go ahead and I'll show you a cool bass setting here. I've got another preset with this. Where are you? Bass. All right. So this is a compressor. So this is some settings I took from a mix of this track that was done by John Graves, who's the product manager of TouchMix, and he's a front of house and recording engineer tour de force here at QSC. So he's got lots of experience, and all of the presets actually in the TouchMix series were created more or less by him. So they're kind of his ears are in the presets. So you're getting a lot of experience really when you're using these presets. Cool. So let's take a look at this bass setting. So this is the bass on the DI input here. Let's go ahead and solo this out. I'm going to reset. Whoops. Reset. Play. Take it out. Are you going to play? Are we not friends anymore? There it is. All right, so there's our bass. Now there's a bass with a compressor. All right. Clear difference. No compression. Compressor. So here, we're using the compressor a lot more in a creative sense. We are definitely kind of relying on it to mitigate the dynamic range of the bass and allow us to kind of position it in the mix appropriately without it kind of clipping through and overpowering anything at any time or getting buried. But it definitely has a distinct effect on the tone of the bass. If we take that off, hear that? It adds a lot of kind of grit to the bass. It kind of adds a little fuzz to it almost. And that quality, again, kind of just gives it some extra texture in the mix so that you can pick it out a little better, and it allows it to just kind of sit well. Let's pull the mix in here. So there's our bass. There's no compressor. See, it's there. It's kind of dull. There you go. Now it fits better. Sounds cool. It's got a little bit of grit to it, so if your ear can kind of pick it out a little better. It's cool. So there you go. That's kind of sonically the difference between using a compressor functionally on a vocal channel and a little more creatively on an instrument channel like a bass. Now clearly, this more or less just kind of scratches the surface on the topic of compression. But we just kind of wanted to give a little introduction to it, explain what it is, and kind of walk through the parameters and give you an idea of kind of what to look for, what to listen for, and how to kind of find the sweet spot in your settings based on what you're compressing here. So I hope that was helpful. One last thing I will show you, I was supposed to show you earlier when I was talking about the graphic here, is, let me punch over to this. This is a generic, compressor plugin in a generic DAW software. And what I wanted to kind of point out here is the square graph in the middle of it. That is a very common compressor graphic that you'll see on just about any compressor plugin, and even some other digital mixing consoles that have compressors built into them. Their user interface will have a graph that's similar to this, and this is cool if you know what you're looking at, but it doesn't tell you everything. The two things that it is not displaying are the time constants. It's not showing you how the compressor reacts over time, kind of like our graphic does. Going back to this, so we have this line that kind of shows you linearly in time how the compressor reacts and how the attack and release are going to affect the signal. This graph here, what it's showing you essentially is you can see that white line there and how it kind of curves up at an angle, and then at one point the angle gets a little more extreme. What that's showing you is that's the point at which the compressor is compressing, and you can see, I don't know if you can see the little red ball that's close to the upper right hand corner there. That little ball is dynamic. That ball will kind of will bounce around based on and it's showing you the level of your signal at any given time. And as it moves up that white line, once it reaches that point where there's kind of that knee in the line, which is kind of where that term comes from, then that's the point where you're being compressed, and it'll kind of sit up beyond that knee, and you know that you're in the state of compression, and you can kind of see at what level you're being compressed. But you have no idea visually how the attack and release are functioning. So again, it can be a little confusing, and even if you kind of get what it's showing you, it's not showing you the whole picture of how the compressor is operating. So just something that's kind of cool that I like to make you aware of in the difference between how different compressors handle their graphic interfaces and what parameters they show you and what they don't show you and all that good stuff. So hopefully that sheds some light on that. If you've seen that before, if you've worked with those compressors before, that's what that graph is showing you. Great. Okay, so I think I got through everything. If I didn't, we're pretty much out of time. Not sure if there were any questions throughout this, but if there are any questions, I can take a few now.
We were not busy in the question department because you were explaining it so thoroughly with all the wonderful examples. Okay, here we have one.
Okay.
Oh, so you see, perfect demo of compression. I can't wait for the limiter show.
Okay, that is coming. We will definitely
Jason.
have. What's that?
You're rocking it.
Well, thank you very much. Very happy that seemed to be helpful. If there's no or little questions, I take it that everyone was kind of following right along with me. Hopefully, being able to listen to it in real time as I explained it kind of offered a level of understanding and to able to kind of acclimate your ear to what it's doing. I highly encourage you to play with this on your own. If you have a touch mix, get some tracks playing through it, get a microphone or plug your instrument into it and start playing with the compressor. If you have another kind of mixer, or if you have a DAW software that features compressor plugins and things like that, get in there and start playing with them and now that hopefully you have an understanding of what the different controls do, you can have a nice idea of where to start from, and you can kind of bring them out to the extremes and experiment on your own and start to kind of acclimate your ears to how the tool works and how best to use it for what you need to use it for.
And here's an interesting question. Can you compress pre-recorded music like a DJ?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You absolutely can.
Absolutely.
It's, again, you got to use your ears. If you're applying compression to an entire track as opposed to individual channels within a mix, it's a lot easier to overcompress it sooner. So you kind of want to pay attention to how it's affecting the sound. A common thing that can happen if you overcompress an entire track is it'll start to kind of sound really muddy and almost distorted at certain points. And I mean, that might be something that you want. I don't know. There are certainly people that kind of use that distorted, over-compressed sound as an effect. You can certainly do that, but that's something to keep in mind when you're doing that, I would say. But yeah,
And
absolutely.
I think this guy is referring to the knee. He wants, I believe so. What is the difference on auto and soft settings? And what do
Auto
they do?
and soft.
Well,
don't
auto
think
sounds like auto gain, and soft
yeah, that's
sounds
probably
like
auto gain. You're probably
knee.
looking at a plugin. So if you're looking at a plugin, so a lot of compressor plugins have something called auto gain or auto release. That's common as well. So auto gain is basically it kind of taking a look at this control here, the makeup gain. If you engage auto gain, it's going to kind of automatically determine at what point is the correct position for the makeup gain, and it's often dynamic, so that when you engage the auto setting, it's usually kind of like fluctuating as the compressor is working. Personally, I usually don't use that setting. I don't really like what it does. I like to kind of just set mine static, but completely up to you how you want to do it. If you encounter something called auto release, that is applying an automatic level of release time here. Instead of you trying to find it and dial it in, it kind of will determine what the appropriate amount of release should be for this signal and kind of just apply that setting. In my experience, actually, the auto release is about 50-50. Oftentimes, you can kind of engage it and listen to it. Sometimes it sounds great, and then you're done. You don't need to dial in your release. Sometimes it won't work, and you still will. But if it's there, it's worth engaging it and seeing what you get. Yeah, that's my advice with that. But that's what those two controls are going to be. Good question. Go back to myself. Whoa, double me. Anything else? These are good questions.
We have greetings from some awesome place here on the earth. It is actually Thursday, 4 a.m. where he is.
Oh, wow. Thanks for staying up.
Thanks for the whole team to come up with this webinar and compression. If the session is recorded, then it is recorded.
So I will say that. So
you'll get an email with the.
You'll get an email in a couple of days with a link to the recording of this session so that you'll be able to go back and rewatch it at your leisure. Then you could even pause it and restart it and go back and rewind at certain sections. So that'll be nice to have. To keep a lookout for that in your email. Usually takes us 2 or 3 days to get that out. Additionally, I'm going to run this same session, the same exact topic, next Tuesday at the same time. I set this one up so that I was going to do it a few weeks in a row consecutively. Just to give the most number of people the opportunity to kind of sign up and take a look, or to give people the opportunity to come back and take it more than once if you want to do that. So if you want to come back, join us next week as well. Look out for the recording. And then also I'll mention on that question about the limiter. So we will get into a discussion about limiting, but first I'm actually going to do sort of a part 2 of the compression topic here. I'm going to kind of take this and I'm going to extrapolate, and I'm going to talk about some more advanced compression applications like side chaining and parallel or multiple compression. So those are all some things that I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to get into that next month once I kind of get through the cycle of compression part 1 here. Next week will be my last version of this, and then I'll get into the more advanced version of the topic, and then we'll probably do limiting at some point in the near future here. So keep an eye out for all of that. We really appreciate you guys joining us for these. And that's all I got. So if there are no more questions going once, going twice. All right.
We're good. Hey.
All right, we're good. We're clear. Okay, everybody. Thanks again.